The empire that conquered half the world. Imagine building the largest empire in the Western Hemisphere. Imagine engineering roads through the highest mountains on Earth, feeding millions of people across deserts, jungles, and frozen highlands. All without a wheel, without iron, and without a single horse. Now imagine doing all of that without writing down a single word. No texts, no scrolls, no inscriptions, no libraries, nothing. History remembers the Greeks for their philosophy, the Romans for their law, the Egyptians for their hieroglyphs. But the Inca built something that rivaled them all, and they did it in total silence, at least on paper. This is the story of the Inca Empire, the greatest civilization the Americas ever produced, and one of the most misunderstood empires in all of human history. To understand just how extraordinary the Inca were, you have to understand the scale of what they built. At its height, the Inca Empire, known in their own language as Tawantinsuyu, which means the four regions together, stretched over 4,000 miles from north to south. That is roughly the distance from New York City to Los Angeles, and then all the way back again. It covered what is today Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, and parts of Colombia. The population was somewhere between 10 and 12 million people. Some estimates go even higher. These were not scattered nomads or loosely affiliated tribes. These were organized, governed, taxed, and fed citizens of a functioning state. And it all happened in one of the most brutal landscapes on Earth, the Andes Mountains. Peaks that soar above 20,000 feet. Passes where the air is so thin that lowlanders lose consciousness within hours. Valleys separated by gorges so deep that sunlight barely reaches the bottom. Ecosystems ranging from tropical rainforest to Arctic tundra, sometimes within a few dozen miles of each other. The Inca did not build around this terrain. They built through it, over it, and into it. Their road network, the Capacnan, stretched more than 25,000 miles. To put that in perspective, the entire Roman road network, built over centuries across 2 continents, was about 50,000 miles. The Inca built half that in a fraction of the time, with no wheeled vehicles and no draft animals for heavy loads. Along those roads, they built a relay messenger system called the Chasqui. Trained runners stationed at intervals of roughly 1.5 miles, passing messages, packages, and even fresh fish from the Pacific coast to the Inca capital of Cusco in the mountains, a journey of hundreds of miles in less than 2 days. 2 days for fresh fish, from the ocean to a mountain city, in the 15th century. So here is the question that has puzzled historians, linguists, and archaeologists for 5 centuries. How did they manage all of this without writing? Every other complex civilization we know of, Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, the Maya, the Aztec, developed some form of writing. Writing is how you record laws. It is how you store knowledge across generations. It is how you coordinate armies, manage taxes, and pass down science, history, and religion. The Inca had no writing system. None that we have found, at least in the conventional sense. no alphabet, no logographic script, no pictographic tablets. The Spanish conquistadors who arrived in 1532 searched extensively and found nothing resembling the written records of other great civilizations. And yet, the empire functioned with extraordinary precision. Tax records were kept, armies were coordinated, history was preserved, rituals were conducted in exact sequence. Census data was collected from millions of people across thousands of miles. How? The answer is one of the most fascinating objects in archaeological history. It is called the Quipu. A quipu, sometimes spelled Quipu, is a collection of colored strings and knots. It looks, at first glance, like something a child might make in an arts and crafts class. Pendant strings hang from a main cord. Each string can be knotted in different ways, at different positions, in different colors. The knots are not random. They encode information. We know, without any doubt, that quipus were used as numerical recording devices. The knot types and positions encode numbers in a base 10 system. Accountants and administrators called quipucamayos, keepers of the quipu, could read and produce these devices with precision. Census data, tribute amounts, storehouse inventories, all of this was captured in knots. But here is where it gets deeply interesting and deeply unresolved. Not all quipus appear to be numerical. Some have knot patterns and color sequences that do not correspond to any known numerical encoding. Researchers have long suspected that some quipus may contain narrative information, stories, histories, records of events, encoded in a system we have not yet cracked.
Out of roughly 900 surviving quipus, only about 400 have been digitized and studied in any serious depth. The rest remain largely unexamined. We may be sitting on an entire literature, and we do not yet know how to read it. But let us set aside the quipu mystery for a moment and ask a more practical question. Even if quipus carried some narrative content, the Inca still relied overwhelmingly on oral transmission for history, law, religion, and culture. How did that actually work? The answer lies in a highly disciplined culture of memory. The Inca had a class of specialists called Amauta, wise men who were trained from childhood to memorize vast quantities of information. Poetry, history, genealogy, religious ritual, administrative law, all of it was held in human minds, recited, rehearsed, and passed from one generation to the next with extreme care. This was not casual storytelling around a fire. This was systematic, rigorous memorization performed as a professional and sacred duty. The Inca court maintained oral historians whose sole responsibility was to remember the deeds of past emperors and recite them on ceremonial occasions. The emperors themselves, called the Sapa Inca, were also preserved in a remarkable way. When an Inca ruler died, his body was mummified and kept in the royal palace. He retained his estates, his servants, and his possessions in death. On important festival days, the mummies of past emperors were brought out, seated in their thrones, and consulted as if they were still alive. Offerings were made to them. Decisions were made in their names. The past was not something the Inca put away. They kept it present. They kept it breathing. Their administrative system also compensated for the absence of writing through redundancy and standardization. The entire empire was built around a system called mita, a labor tax. Instead of paying money, citizens contributed their labor. They built roads, worked in mines, served in the military, and farmed state lands. In return, the state fed them, clothed them, and provided for them in times of hardship. This system required precise coordination across millions of people. It worked because the Inca standardized everything. Storage facilities called kolkas were built at regular intervals along the road network, stocked with food, weapons, and clothing. Provincial governors followed uniform administrative protocols. Quipus recorded the numbers. Runners carried the information, and trained officials implemented the results. It was a bureaucracy that ran on memory, knots, and trust. It would be a mistake to think of the Inca only as administrators. They were also extraordinary builders. Machu Picchu is the most famous example, but it represents only a fraction of what they constructed. The site, built in the 15th century and never completed, sits at nearly 8,000 feet above sea level on a ridge between two mountain peaks. It contains over 200 structures. Its stone walls were built without mortar. Individual stones cut so precisely that a blade of grass cannot be slipped between them. And yet they have survived 5 centuries of earthquakes. This technique, called ashlar masonry, required not just skill, but an entire system of quarrying, transport, and placement. The Inca moved stones weighing over 100 tons without wheels, without iron tools, and without any animal stronger than a llama. Modern engineers have studied the methods and still argue about exactly how it was done. Their agriculture was equally innovative. The Andes do not offer easy farmland. The steep slopes are prone to erosion. The climate shifts dramatically with altitude. The Inca responded by building terraces called andenes, carved into the mountainsides for hundreds of miles. These terraces did not just create flat planting surfaces, they were engineered drainage systems, irrigation networks, and microclimatic controls. By adjusting the depth of different soil layers and the angle of the terraces, Inca farmers could grow crops at altitudes that would otherwise be impossible. They also developed one of the most sophisticated food preservation systems in history, freeze-drying potatoes to create a product called chuno, which could be stored for years, drying meat into charqui, the ancestor of what we now call jerky. Their storehouses were climate-controlled through ventilation systems built directly into the architecture. The Inca were not primitive. They were solving engineering problems that we would find challenging today, with nothing but stone, rope, labor, and intelligence. No empire exists without a belief system to justify and sustain it. For the Inca, that system was built around the sun.
The Inca believed their emperor was the direct son of Inti, the sun god. This was not merely a political claim. It was the organizing principle of their entire cosmology. The sun was the source of warmth, agriculture, and life. The Sapa Inca was its earthly representative. To obey the emperor was to align oneself with the divine order of the universe. Their capital, Cusco, was designed as the center of the world. The word Cusco itself means navel in Quechua, their language. From this center, sacred lines called seques radiated outward in all directions, connecting shrines, springs, hills, and sacred sites across the landscape. There were 41 seques, lined with over 300 individual shrines.
Ritual specialists were responsible for maintaining and attending each one. The Inca practiced human sacrifice, though far less frequently than is sometimes portrayed. The most significant ritual was called capacocha. Children, selected for their physical perfection, were brought to Cusco from across the empire for a great ceremony. They were feasted, honored, and worshipped. Then they were taken to remote mountain peaks and sacrificed, left to die of exposure in the cold and thin air at altitudes above 20,000 feet. This sounds brutal to modern ears, but within the Inca framework, these children were not victims. They were messengers. They were sent to communicate with the gods on behalf of the empire. The mountains where they were placed were themselves divine. The children became sacred. Several of these sacrificial victims have been found by modern archaeologists, preserved by the cold for 500 years. Their bodies, clothes, and ritual objects remain intact. They are among the most poignant archaeological finds in history. In 1532, everything ended. Francisco Pizarro arrived on the coast of South America with fewer than 200 soldiers. He had horses, he had steel weapons, he had firearms, and he had timing. The Inca Empire was in the middle of a devastating civil war. The previous Sapa Inca, Huayna Capac, had died suddenly, almost certainly from smallpox, which had reached South America years before the Spanish themselves did, traveling ahead of them through indigenous trade networks. His two sons, Huáscar and Atahualpa, had been fighting for control of the empire. Atahualpa had just won when Pizarro arrived. At a meeting in the town of Cajamarca, Pizarro set a trap. Atahualpa arrived with thousands of attendants, but no weapons. This was to be a diplomatic encounter. The Spanish attacked without warning. In the chaos, they captured Atahualpa. What followed was one of the most extraordinary ransoms in history. Atahualpa offered to fill a room, approximately 17 feet long by 22 feet wide, once with gold and twice with silver, in exchange for his freedom. The Inca delivered. Gold and silver objects poured in from across the empire, sacred objects, temple decorations, ceremonial items, all of it melted down into bars. The Spanish took the ransom, and then they killed Atahualpa anyway. The empire did not fall immediately. Inca resistance continued for decades. A rump state survived in the remote mountain region of Vilcabamba until 1572. But the core had been shattered. The administrative system collapsed. The Amauta were killed or scattered. The oral traditions began to break down. The Quipus were burned or lost. Spanish authorities ordered their destruction, fearing they contained religious content. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, unwritten and unrecoverable, disappeared. Here is the deepest tragedy in this story. Because the Inca did not write, the destruction of their human networks meant the destruction of their knowledge. When the Amauta died, the histories they carried died with them. When the Quipu Kamayaks were scattered, the archives they held in string and knot became unreadable. When the Spanish burned the Quipus, they were not just destroying objects, they were burning libraries. What we know about the Inca comes primarily from three sources: archaeological evidence, the buildings, the roads, the storehouses, the mummies; Spanish colonial records, written by people who were simultaneously destroying what they were recording, with all the biases that implies; and a handful of indigenous accounts, written down decades after the conquest by people who had grown up in the empire and tried to preserve what they remembered. Each of these sources is partial, each is distorted, and none of them can tell us what the Inca thought about themselves, in their own words, preserved in their own system.
We do not know the names of the architects who designed Machu Picchu. We do not know the full extent of their astronomical knowledge. We do not know their literature, their philosophy, or their full understanding of medicine, though we know it was sophisticated because their surgical techniques which we can observe archaeologically, include successful trepanation, the drilling of holes in the skull to relieve pressure, with survival rates that suggest real medical competence. We do not know what stories they told their children. We do not know their jokes, their love songs, or their prayers in anything but fragments. And yet, researchers continue to work. The Quipu database project is digitizing surviving Quipus in hopes that patterns will emerge that reveal narrative content. Linguists are studying Quechua, which is still spoken by millions of people in the Andes today, looking for echoes of the old world in the living language. Archaeologists are still uncovering new sites, new objects, new information. The Inca are not fully gone. They are partly buried, and the excavation continues. There is something both humbling and haunting about the Inca. We live in a world that is drowning in recorded information. Every thought, every purchase, every conversation leaves a digital trace. We have more data about the last 10 years of human activity than about all of recorded history combined. And yet we somehow feel that the past is always knowable, always retrievable, always just a search away. The Inca remind us that civilizations can be enormous, sophisticated, and brilliant, and still disappear almost entirely. That knowledge is fragile, that culture is fragile, that the things we fail to write down, fail to preserve, fail to protect, those things can vanish as if they never existed. The Inca conquered half a continent. They fed millions of people across impossible terrain. They built cities that still puzzle engineers. They knitted an empire together with roads and runners and memory and string. And then, in less than a lifetime, it was gone. What remains is stone. What remains is rope. What remains are the 9 million Quechua speakers alive today, descendants of the Inca, carrying in their language and their culture the last echoes of an empire that once stretched from the jungle to the snow. We may never fully decode the Quipus. We may never know the histories the Amauta carried in their minds. But the question they force us to ask is one worth sitting with. How much of what we know, of who we are, depends on the records we choose to keep? And what are we, right now, failing to write down?